In working group 2, we're basically going to use the same index as Jeroen talked about. But the context is different because we're going to focus on the US. So I want to give, also for all the other trainees, just a very quick sketch of the US situation. And Becky, maybe you know it better, so correct me if I make mistakes. So many years. Well, but this goes back to 1964. The Civil Rights Act. So big picture that the US is surprisingly, you might forget, but the routine was separate but equal up till 1964, meaning that blacks and whites were separated, fully separated, and supposedly to be equal. So they had to sit in the back of the bus. They had their separate schools. They had their separate toilets. It was bizarre. They couldn't go to every hotel. There was a special guidebook saying where you could go and sleep in a hotel if you were traveling, and where you could have dinner, because as a black person you could not enter most establishments. This was the situation in the US up till formerly 64, until, I forgot her name, Rosa Parks got on the bus and refused to sit in the back. And of course it didn't come from nowhere. There was of course already lots of things happening in society against this situation.
It wasn't universal, it was based on states. The whole issue.
Yeah. You see, I knew you could correct me.
States' rights.
It's states' rights.
It's about states' rights versus federal.
Okay. So the federal law won here because civil rights.
But the South continually claims that the reason for their right to discriminate is because of the states' issue, not federal.
And of course, states can discriminate, but not at the federal level. That's obvious.
You should also point out that in the northern states there was also discrimination. It just wasn't enforced in the same way.
Okay. Okay.
Yeah, sure.
Okay. Okay. So in the north, the blacks, indeed, you're right. After the Civil War. Exactly. Okay, whatever. So this was in the south. Okay, it was only half of the country. Anyway, and then this changed in 1964, formally at least, with the Civil Rights Act, which basically called for equal rights, irrespective of your background, the ethnic minority, your color, and so forth. And actually also, and that's the part that I want to talk about, also called for restoration of all the things that had been done wrong to mostly the black population. And so that Civil Rights Act has a number of articles, and they're called titles. So title is one article, one line, one section in the law. Very confusing words for a non-American. So Title 6, and Title 6 became very well known also in transport. So that's why I'm reading it out, and I will explain how it became important. So Title 6 reads, "No person shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be excluded from participation in, be denied the benefits of, or be subjected to discrimination under any program or activity receiving federal financial assistance." Meaning, if you didn't want federal money, you could still discriminate. That's also one way of interpreting it. Now, in transport, they always needed federal money, so it basically means you could not discriminate anymore. No problem. So, but what does it mean, not discriminate? What does it mean to deny the benefits? That basically has been, since 1964, a question that has been debated in the US, and the US is very interesting in the sense that defining what is justice is very much done through legal proceedings. So organizations would gather together and would sue a state or a school or a company and force a lawyer, a judge in the end, to interpret the law and to define how we should interpret it. So that led to very progressive results, but also later on, actually, the 90s to less progressive results. In the 1990s, the Civil Rights Act was also the basis for a new executive order. That's not really a law. I kind of don't exactly know, I must say, what it is. Something the president can actually approve, but it doesn't have the status of a law. A regulation, yeah, but it's also an unclear term, a regulation, right? What is a law and what is a regulation? Anyway, it's basically the environmental justice movement I was talking about. Actually, this was one of the major achievements, formal achievements of the environmental justice movement that drew on the Title 6 of the Civil Rights Act on calling for more equal treatment also in citing of hazardous industries and so forth. And so the executive order signed by President Clinton was reads as follows: each federal agency shall make achieving environmental justice part of its mission by identifying and addressing as appropriate disproportionately high and adverse human health or environmental effects of its programs, policies and activities on minority populations and low-income groups. So again, a call basically on transportation, on many government agencies, but also on transportation planning institutions, to assess whether their programs, their highway projects, their railway projects would negatively affect, through environmental externalities, minority populations. Now, what I've been concerned about, for those who know my work, is mostly on accessibility. So, what Title VI has done and environmental justice has done, it mostly focused on environmental externalities of transport projects. So, to what extent environmental pollution, noise, actually haven't ended up in poor neighborhoods where minority populations would live. There are lots of assessments of whether this happens or not, and there's also legal proceedings that managed to succeed to block some projects, actually, because the projects would clearly had a negative impact on minorities. Now the question if you can also use Title VI actually to demand fairness in accessibility. Does Title VI provide that reason? And if so, what does Title VI mean? Now, if you look at more of the regulations around it and guidelines around it, that you see that Title VI is also about the benefits. Distribution of benefits is an issue, although it came only up in the late 80s, early 90s. But in all the regulations around Title VI, there is nowhere where the benefits are really defined precisely. So, okay, you're not allowed to deny people benefits, but what do we do with these benefits? It's unclear. We don't know what we mean with those benefits. And more difficult, you don't really define what does it mean to deny benefits. So when did I deny somebody benefits? And so what I tried to do in my work with an American colleague was try to interpret Title VI and see whether we could come up with possible interpretation, and then look at what did metropolitan planning organizations who do the regional transport plans in the US, how they, which standards they use. So we try to interpret Title VI and see what kind of standards of fairness you could derive from it, looking at the text of the title itself and then the interpretations around it. So again, it says, no person shall, on the ground of race, color, or national origin, be denied the benefits of any program that gets federal assistance. So the question is, how should we interpret deny the benefits? What does it mean? Now the first interpretation, which was dominant for some time, is like is sometimes seen as the interpretation of Title VI. The idea was to stop discrimination. We were discriminating, and we were making decisions. The white got this and the black got that, and we don't want this discrimination. We don't want to have decisions being made on whether somebody is black or white or whatever other minority he or she is. So the only thing that's important is that our decisions should be based on notions of content, on good reasons that are not related to the person's color, but somebody gets a better school because he's not well educated. That's a good argument. We build a road because the road is congested. That's a good argument. We don't build a road because we're serving a white suburb, and we give a poor bus because it's a black guy. So basically the first interpretation of Title VI just means it's very legal if somebody didn't deliberately discriminate, if decisions were made on good reasons, then they are allowed. And so they're called race-neutral practices, meaning I make decisions based on content. The results might be discriminatory in the sense that if I want to avoid congestion and for this reason I build a rail line to the suburbs, it will serve 90%, 95% only whites. But because I use proper standards, professional standards, I didn't do anything wrong, and I lived up to Title VI. That's one interpretation. So the legal or perpetrator perspective, the perspective from the person doing the act. Did he actively discriminate or not? Now the second one is another interpretation of denied the benefits. So you could say you're being denied the benefits of any investment with federal money. If you don't get anything, you should at least get something. Everybody should get some benefits out of federal money. Federal money is flowing, and each group should get something out of this. Otherwise, you're being denied the benefits of that federal money that is flowing to you as a state. So basically means kind of Pareto, but it's a little bit more than Pareto. In the case of Pareto, you would say, some people can get more and other people just stay in the same situation. And then the situation is improved. So now, if you don't get anything, you're still denied the benefit. So you should at least get something. So a Pareto plus. Everybody should get a little bit, but it doesn't matter if some people get much more. Still, everybody got some benefits. And a third interpretation that goes back to the environmental justice order is a proportionality standard, which basically says something is fair if you get your share according to the proportion you have in the population. So it's basically like an equality standard, but less precise. So not everybody should get exactly its share in the population. So if the black are 20% of the population and the Hispanics are another 20%, it's fine if one gets 15 and the other 25 and so forth. But it should be roughly proportional. So it's a kind of the ideal of equality, which is very powerful and very a basic starting point for philosophers of justice. Start from equality and then provide good reasons to deviate from it. Proportionality is kind of embracing the equality standard with allowing some standard deviation around it. And this principle has been used a lot with externality. So you could also use it with accessibility, you could say. And then the third interpretation actually goes back to what the Civil Rights Act was intended to do. Was basically to restore past injustices, to correct the situation, to make sure the black population would again be full part of American society. And another argument could be, if you say that if I make a new project and the benefits should be distributed proportionally to population groups, then why something we created in the past that was clearly disproportionate effects would be fair? If I demand proportionality now, I should also demand proportionality in the past. And so if it wasn't there, I should correct it. And so I actually should go now beyond proportionality to generate proportionality in the future. And so I should have restorative justice. And this perspective is also called the victim's perspective. So it's not about whether the person is discriminating the black person or not. It's about whether, if I don't do something, that minority has really the same opportunities as the majority population. And so it calls for affirmative action. So we have these 4 standards which we derived from the Title VI legislation, and then we create an equity ladder, like there is the participation ladder of Arnstein. We create an equity ladder saying, some are more progressive, you could say. So you start with the legal interpretation, which says you're not allowed to discriminate, but whatever you do, and you justify it with proper reasons, it's fine. To Pareto, where nobody gets worse off, but one person is better off. Pareto Plus requires something from everybody, proportional in relation to your share in the population. And then equalization, restoration requires really correcting differences that are still there. And so clearly, if somebody in metropolitan planning organization would use the higher up standards, they are more embracing real equality between population groups. And so we were curious which standards are being used. And so the interesting thing, the first thing that we found out is that we only analyzed the plans of 10 metropolitan planning organizations. It that have explicit text which says just the legal definition is not enough. So Los Angeles MPO says Title VI not only bars intentional discrimination, the legal interpretation, but also unjustified disparate impact discrimination. So, you can interpret it in many ways, but for me it means like basically we should not only avoid, deliberate discrimination, we should do more than that. We should also look at the impacts of what we do. And in Philadelphia, they warn that a neutral policy or practice may have disparate impacts on protected groups. So they also realize that just not discriminating is not enough, we should go beyond it. And also in other plans with the MPOs, we see that that language is there. So legal, actually all MPOs reject the legal interpretation, which is interesting because there was a ruling in the 90s which actually re-established the legal interpretation. It's enough to not discriminate, even if you never give a job to any black person in your company, if you only select people based on their qualities, it's fine if there are only white people working there. It was the ruling in the 90s. So it's kind of, it has a legal backing, but the NPOs don't want it. They want to go beyond this. So let's see where the NPOs are. So we analyzed them, and their plans are very chaotic. They do equity analysis. They just have a bunch of projects. They're already in the drawer. They're already in their mind, and then they have to do the equity analysis because Title VI requires it. So this is what you happen if you put equity on top of the existing planning process. You just have the planning machinery going on, and you do equity analysis on top of it. And then you're confused because you don't know what equity analysis is. So you use various measurements of which are related to accessibility. You use travel time savings, you use job housing balance, you use affordability index. You look only at current trips, or you look at accessibility in a geographical sense, how many jobs it can reach. So there are many multiple standards being used, and then there are also multiple fairness standards being used, but without ever using any formal language. So they're doing something and they had to get a result. So, well, you know, we see here that the minority population get a little bit more, so that's great. And in the next case, they say, well, we see here that the minority population gets roughly the same as the majority population, so it's fine. And here they say, well, they get slightly less, but that's not too bad, you know, we're pretty close. This is about the language that you see in these plans. So we try to interpret it, and this is how you get up. So the interesting thing is that sometimes they do actually implicitly seem to use equalization. I mean, they analyze the situation in such a way that they compare the current situation and see how the projects improve or make the gap smaller. So they actually go to the highest rung on the ladder. So we were very actually surprised to see so progressive thinking happening in the equity analysis. To what extent it actually impacts the transfer plans is a different matter. So this is just all background for everybody of you, what's happening in the US. It's very interesting, the legal thing that's happening there, I think. For the working group too, it's just a background for what you're going to do. Because we're going to also use the Accessibility Fairness Index, which Jeroen talked about, but we're going to use it on American data sets. And why is it relevant in Title VI, in connection to Title VI, and so into the real questions in the US? Because in the US, I've been in TRB, you know, and I came there naive and not knowing the US really how it works. Talking about justice in transport, you know, and I didn't know about the sensitivities about ethnic minorities. You could say, you know, in the Holland it's under the surface. You could say it's not so apparent. In the US, it's really, really an issue. So having an indicator that actually can identify whether minority groups getting a fair share is very important in the US. It can you have to show it because Title VI requires you to do the equity analysis. So what the Accessibility Fairness Index enables you to do, and you can explain, is actually to identify the situation of each group and to see which groups are below the sufficiency threshold, and also how do I improve their situation. So actually I can use the index to then actually come up with the contribution of each population, ethnic population group. They're spread over a metropolitan area, but I can add them up in my index, and I can see to what extent do they contribute today to a lack of accessibility. I can analyze to what extent the improvements are benefiting those minority groups. And so I can use both proportionality standard, I can use an equalization standard, I can also use a separator plus standard. I can use them all if I have my accessibility fairness index. And so basically, I'm just doing marketing here for my index. You can use this index actually in Title VI context. And so that's the context I want the working group to work in, to realize the importance of the ethnic tensions in the US and the importance of addressing that issue, which maybe in other countries are less apparent or less relevant, but they are very important. And these are the 4 cities you're going to work on later today and tomorrow. And I hope to see interesting analysis from you. So thank you.